Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about game design verbiage, just like what using certain terms in your game design does to that game design. vampbug says, I heard you mention offhand in the crew parlay that there's been talk about video game verbiage on streams and such. Let's look over a bunch of keywords in Magic the Gathering and Legends of Runeterra, the Riot Games League of Legends card game, for this parlay. And you can give me some thoughts on which name you prefer for a given mechanic and other such talk on this topic. There's a lot of mechanical overlap between these two games. Keywords Magic the Gathering uses will be listed first, as you're probably more familiar with them. Just assume combat rules are the same for both games. They mostly are. Only keep in mind board states in Legends of Runeterra are limited to like 6 creatures on board for each player, so there aren't armies of tokens running around. And then you have a list of a bunch of keywords, the Magic the Gathering version and the Legends of Runeterra version, and we're meant to assume that they function identically. It's just the name of the mechanic that's different. You end simply, these are the majority of the overlapping keywords. Let's see how this parlay goes. Thank you. Okay, so immediately I think a lot of people might have a question about what even is this parlay? Like, what are we doing? For example, the first one is flying versus elusive. Can't be blocked when attacking, except by other creatures that have this keyword. In Magic the Gathering, it's flying. In Legends of Runeterra, it's elusive. Like, but who cares? What is there to discuss about those two names? Oh, I get it, though, quite a bit, I think. So, of course, at the beginning here, we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's even kind of 2 parts to that discussion before we go through each of these terms. And then I actually have some examples of my own, too, from other game design. So basically, the thing to establish here is that using a certain word does do something to help people's understanding of what's going on. And the primary thing we'll be evaluating is how well do these words accomplish that? How well do these words do their job? So just as a very simple example that isn't in any card game or any specific game, just vampbug and then my decision to use verbiage as a word here to mean this subject, what word do you use to refer to a concept in game design, is a choice. It is, and I mean no offense when I say this, vampbug, but in my opinion, it's a slightly choice, because I find, I have a bias in this subject, that people really bounce off of words that sound like complex or subtle or intellectual. I'm going to have a bit of a bone to pick for just a moment about anti-intellectualism. I think that people can be very prickly about things sounding involved. I honestly think people are pretty pathetic about this nowadays a lot of the time. Because something sounds technical, they just sort of instantly switch their brain off. Like it's sort of not been proven that that is worthwhile. This is really weird. It's funny because it's a problem in both ways, right? People over respect intellectuals, but also now there's a lot of people who have a tendency to under respect like actual intellect, like thinking about things. Just because someone says they're an expert doesn't in any way mean that what they have to say is going to be especially valuable. It might not. They're subject to the same logical rules as everyone else. They have to have a good reason for what they think. And if we can't tell, we might choose to trust the expert over a layperson, sure. But that's not a very good idea most of the time. Trusting the expert is also not a very good idea most of the time. Likewise, if somebody says something that sounds complicated, rejecting it simply because it seems highfalutin is obviously ridiculous. Like, you should think about what they said and see if it makes some sense. And then, of course, living a human life is challenging because we have to make, not that educated decisions about these things all the time. But they're both extremely stupid things to do, rejecting things that way. The simple example of why this kind of verbiage would matter then is that although it's a massive logical fallacy, people avoiding, or being biased against terms because they sound intellectual or whatever, it's still like a thing a lot of humanity has. And a lot of people that would not go so far as to do that in like an actual discussion still have a bias against, words that sound unnatural. So for example, in coffee production, there are a couple of different ways that coffee is commonly decaffeinated. Some solvent will be used to remove the caffeine, but hopefully as few of the other flavors as possible, keeping the coffee delicious, but without the caffeine that's in the way of people enjoying the coffee. And one of the really common methods is ethyl acetate. Now you might be thinking, okay, I mean, it sounds like a chemical process. Why is that noteworthy? Well, because the other big ones are like CO2. You know, CO2 sounds bad, but people know what CO2 is. Swiss water. Oh, water, Swiss. That sounds nice. You know, it doesn't matter. I mean, ethyl acetate is a byproduct of sugarcane production. It's not like bad to use ethyl acetate for this. In the first place, it's just science. Like things are just chemicals. Obviously, using ethyl acetate versus some, I don't know, water, which sounds more natural. I mean, it could be way worse. Soaking the coffee in a bunch of water sounds bad on the surface. That's not really how Swiss water works, but you know, it doesn't sound good on the surface. Whereas ethyl acetate, well, it sounds chemically. But putting it another way, yeah, I mean, if it's a solvent that is hand-picked because it specifically dissolves only caffeine, well, that's really good. That would be good. That would make the coffee taste better, more natural, if you will, rather than futzing with its flavors more, but with a more natural solvent, you know, if you used water. That's not exactly how Swiss water works. It's just an example. But you get the point. Obviously, the people who do ethyl acetate decaffeinate coffee know this, and they hate that term. You often hear it called sugarcane process, or ethyl acetate will emphasize that it's organic, like stuff like that. It doesn't, obviously, it doesn't matter at all. Like that has no, it's irrelevant. Oh, the only thing that matters is what actually happens to the coffee. But people tend to get turned off when they hear ethyl acetate. It's like how people bias toward organic or natural foods, even though there's good things about those, don't get me wrong, but like a lot of the time it doesn't really make a significant difference. So while it's a complicated issue, I hope you see my point. People are quite reductive about these subjects. And while that isn't logically a valid thing to do, you know, we can at least admit that we don't know and if we have a bias, rather than just obeying the bias and saying, meh, chemical name bad. People absolutely do have huge associations with these words and get massively turned off or checked out mentally when they hear a word framed a certain way. I won't try any harder than this. I don't want to belittle people to convince you that using a certain type of word does matter. It does matter what these words mean. But it's kind of like when people say something that, you know, was historically an offensive term that they consider not offensive or they don't mean in an offensive way. And they feel the need to say, well, but that's not what I meant by it, or why are you taking offense at this term used this way? But using words in a certain way does have that effect. I mean, you can say, I wish it didn't, like, okay, but it like does though. So people do react to these things. And I think that this is no more clear than in the caffeine example I gave. But the second most clear place is with these mechanical terms. Yeah, when you're explaining a board game or, I don't know, a video game or something, the words, the little things kind of bug people out. Now, I am probably the worst person on earth to represent people's frustration with that subject in a way, because I think it's easy, and I've always thought it was easy, and it's easy. You can just make systems for understanding things, and it's not a big deal. But I know very well, because I am that way, that people are, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, afraid of these systems. To them, the idea of getting into a new game and learning its systems is terrifying. And so we're going a little bit beyond the word you use does matter in some ways that it kind of logically shouldn't too. Learning a game in the first place is just hard. And so making it nicer in simple ways is important. Like that is a very valuable thing. If you want people to play your game, a hugely undersung reason people drop games early on is that they just bounce off of learning the game. So with that in mind, we might talk about that more as we go, but let's just look at an example quickly and you'll see what I mean. So looking at the first few terms, we have flying versus elusive and reach versus sharp sight. Now these are a good pair. Flying versus elusive can't be blocked when attacking, except by other creatures that have this keyword. So flying creatures can't be blocked except by other creatures that have flying. Flying also then means you can block flying creatures. Same thing with elusive. Can't be blocked when attacking except by other creatures that have this keyword. It can block elusive creatures, and it can't be blocked except by elusive creatures. And then reach and sharp sight are kind of an addition to that mechanical design. So reach creatures can block creatures with flying, but don't have the offensive advantage of flying. They're able to reach creatures that are flying to attack you, and block them, but they don't themselves have the advantage of flying when they attack. So it's a weaker version of flying, you could say. It's the defensive half. Same thing with sharp sight. This can block creatures with elusive without having that keyword themselves. So it can block elusive creatures, but it doesn't get the offensive benefit of elusive. Now, I'm biased here because I've played Magic and I only barely know of Legends of Runeterra. But to me, flying is a really, really good name for that keyword because you kind of feel it. The enemy's sort of up here. You can even just, when teaching Magic, you could just physically lift the card and people can see, oh, that's like, it's above the other creatures, so it can fly over them, in a visual, intuitive, about flying creatures in real life kind of way. It's easy to understand, and thus it is easier to sort of learn that keyword. And then reach, again, pretty obvious, you can reach up and stop it. Okay, so what about elusive and sharp sight? Well, initially my reaction is this is a lot worse. You lose that like kinesthetic benefit, but there are also a lot of benefits that are to me pretty obvious. For example, flying is not only there to be good at being learned, it's also there as a kind of immersion thing. These keywords are more than just, is it easy for a new player to pick up? They're also, when you give a card this ability, how do you kind of make it feel like that's okay, essentially? Now, in Magic the Gathering, this doesn't mean that any creature you want to give evasion, any creature you want to make good at attacking players, harder to block, has to have flying, has to be edited to have wings. No, there are creatures that just say, this creature is unblockable. Like, that is a thing in Magic, although not super frequent. Most of the cards that are meant to be harder to block are given some hand wavy or not way that they are flying, physically flying. And while you could say that trading teaching flexibility, you get more of that, but you trade away like lore flexibility, it can be harder to show, I guess, why this creature can fly, or you can only easily give this mechanic that makes creatures hard to block to creatures that can justifiably fly. Again, you can say they're unblockable. I think is a good trade-off, yes, but it's a trade-off. So you see what I mean? Hopefully rather quickly, we've populated the parlay with there are a surprising number of reasons why it could be valuable, important, to pick these things in a certain way. I want to go back to elusive and sharp sight again. I think that these don't make a good pair. I get that if a creature is elusive, that it's like hard to see them sneaking through enemy lines, and so you can't block them as easily. But I don't really get that a creature with sharp sight would be able to stop a creature that's elusive, a creature that's, it sounds like invisible. You know what I mean? I don't feel like elusive is strongly enough correlated with I visually can't see them. It just sounds like they're good at dodging. And likewise, why does a creature that's good at dodging block creatures that are good at dodging better? I guess kind of, like if you had more agility, but I think you get the point. Without dumping on it too much, I personally think it's just way less intuitive, much, much less intuitive. To me, decisive win for flying and reach. I think elusive and sharp sight are surprisingly bad, but not terrible. Again, you can imagine that giving elusiveness, the quality that the creature is just dodgy, that feels more flexible. It feels easier from a lore perspective to give that to more stuff without changing it. And that means that you don't need to say this creature is unblockable as a separate thing. I've heard players I've taught Magic before say, why does this say this creature is unblockable and this creature says it has flying, which is the same thing? And I'll say, well, technically, the flying creature can be blocked. It's just harder to block. Whereas the unblockable creature, it's just unblockable no matter what. But yes, it's a subtle distinction. Your game could probably live without, the two keywords. It would be kind of nice if there was only one, right? And you could mimic unblockability by saying the creature has flying and makes enemy creatures like not have flying, or like it can't be blocked by flyers or something, if you wanted to. So there are ways that you could make it be only one keyword, but elusive maybe has a better chance of being able to go on more cards. You see what I mean? And that could drop down the number of keywords in the game. So sure, I don't know. I mean, I actually think sharp sight is pretty limited though. Like elusive, I do think is versatile. I think that's the only point I find in its favor. Otherwise, I think flying is more intuitive, it's more visual, and I like flying and reach as a pair. I don't like elusive and sharp sight as a pair. They're more versatile, like lore wise, but I think that's less valuable than teaching the game because people won't play the game at all if they don't get in the door there. But and elusive is versatile. I feel like sharp sight is a little tricky, but reach has always been a little weird too. Like a lot of the time in Magic the Gathering, creatures with reach are just like very tall, like really big. And so it can be a little hand wavy sometimes. You know, there's a lot of deeper game design reasons why these mechanics can be complicated too. In Magic, I don't know anything about Legends of Runeterra for this, so just the Magic example. Flying is a very specifically blue keyword. Other colors get it, though green very rarely gets it. But one of the five colors of the game gets, you know, a lot of flyers, more flyers. And blue gets a lot of flyers partly because blue often has weaker creatures on the ground, except large creatures. Blue's basic dudes, blue being the color of knowledge, study, and insight, are like not good at the fisticuffs, and so they're smaller, but tend to be given the bonus of having like evasion of some kind. Lots of unblockable creatures are blue too, usually because they can like phase through a wall or are invisible or something, or because they fly or something like that. A ghost, you know, could easily have either, and I can think of ghost creatures that have flying and which say are unblockable. So yeah. But Reach is kind of designed to be Green's way to deal with flying. Green has good creatures, but because Green's creatures are really big, one reason to avoid flying in Green, besides just giving Blue its own thing, is that then Green's creatures would be able to fly, would be evasive, while being like the biggest creatures. And a lot of them also intuitively would have trample, which we'll talk about in a minute. And trample and flying together is very, very strong. So they're often given a reach instead to mimic the idea that green has good creatures, which are only useful if they can actually attack and block with them. So giving green a way to interact with flyer is good, but giving green the evasion of flying bad. Therefore, reach. And so a lot of green creatures being just like large, you know, presumably can swat down the bird or whatever. It doesn't really make sense though. Anyway, I was just saying that sharp sight might be sort of difficult. This is a much more fun part than you expected, isn't it? See, I was looking forward to this one. Let's move on to trample and overwhelm. It's not a huge thing, but personally, I think flying and reach are significantly better. A lot of these are way more similar than those two, so it's going to get harder from here. Trample versus Overwhelm is the Legends of Runeterra version. Trample, or Overwhelm, means excess damage done to blockers spills over to the opponent's health. A big rhino charges into enemy lines and is blocked by one guy, a foot soldier, who is killed by a lot, and the excess damage hits the controller's life total because it's a rhino and it's not going to be stopped just because it ran over a foot soldier. That's the idea. So trample. I really like trample. It's very easy to understand. Again, very similar design philosophy to flying. The creature physically tramples over the enemies. Again, you can imagine with a lot of the magic ones, what's good about these is that you can physically show with the card what's going to happen, or they're quite animal focused descriptions, if you will, very physical. They're not personal qualities, they're like beast qualities. You're thinking back, we'll keep this in mind as we keep going, but elusive and sharp sight, they feel more like human descriptions of evasion. Flying and reach feels more like beast descriptions of those evasion qualities, blocking qualities. Interesting. So anyway, if you have more types of characters of one or the other in your game. Magic is mostly beasts, so yeah, it works. But overwhelm is fine. Also fine. Again, a much smaller difference, right? Trample and overwhelm feel really similar. Like to some extent, overwhelm is just the same thing, or a lot of people would think of the same thing. Overwhelm is maybe even like more literal, but trampled is just a little bit more physical, maybe I would say. So this one is kind of a wash in my mind. I still prefer Trample overall for Magic's design, but Overwhelm, it feels kind of martial. I'm thinking about Elusive and Sharpsight again. You can see how together that kind of fits a vibe. If Legends of Runeterra is populated by like a bunch of humanoid soldiers, it feels like these words will fit from a lore perspective pretty easily. Though, again, I personally don't want to overly emphasize the merits of that. I really think that is a secondary benefit. But yeah, there's nothing really wrong with Overwhelm in my opinion. I just think Trample is a really good way to describe that. Okay, Life Link versus Life Steal. Life Link and Life Steal. This one is tricky. So this means, probably it's intuitive to most of you, damage dealt by this creature, even outside of attacking or blocking, heals the creature's controller. In Legends of Runeterra, you can't heal over your starting life total. Okay, so a couple of things. Life Link. I've never liked Life Link as a keyword, because it's lifesteal. Lifesteal is a commonly used game design term. And so, because lifelink like is lifesteal, I sort of wish it was that. I guess the problem is that it's not life steal as in the creature doing the damage gets healed. The creature does damage and then you get healed. The summoner gets healed. So life link evokes that a little bit better. The idea that you're linked to the creature you summoned. I just think that a lot of people in the fantasy of the game do not at every moment imagine that setup. This is the most pedantic part of any parlay of all time, but you're playing a game of Magic the Gathering. You've got your deck, you got your creatures and stuff, your hand, you've summoned some stuff, you're playing Magic the Gathering. What are you doing in the fantasy? Well, your deck, your library it's called, is the stuff you know. A land card is a place you visited, from which you have a mana bond, and you can draw mana to cast your spells. The creatures in your deck are creatures you know or have a summoning pact with, that's not always clear, and you can summon them using that mana to fight for you. Instants and sorceries, enchantments, spells you can cast, artifacts, objects you own, planeswalkers, friends you have in this multiverse hopping adventure. Okay, but do people at every moment think of the game in terms of that, like, nuts and bolts lore fantasy? I think not. I think that they think of them as like their creature. It's their creature. Specifically, I mean, it's its own creature, but they summon the creature. The creature's on their side of the board. They have this creature and this much life. And so if the creature does damage and life steals and then they heal, I think a lot of people find that very intuitive. Now, technically speaking, there's a distinction here, sure. But I personally think that it's a close enough concept that it would help a lot of people if it just was called lifesteal, basically. Is lifelink that bad? No, you can probably figure it out. It's fine, I guess. But I like lifesteal. I don't want to get too nitpicky. There's no set definitions of these things, really. It's a word cloud of what we all think of them. But it is true that lifesteal has the added elegance for Legends of Runeterra that lifesteal often means, yeah, like you heal back up your health bar. You don't gain health, you restore health you lost by doing damage. And so not healing over your starting life total, that is a quality lifesteal effects often have. So that's nice. Not a huge deal. But again, just like lifelink, right? The distinction between lifelink and lifesteal, also not a big deal. So this is one where, yeah, in nuts and bolts, they're pretty much the same, and yet there are surprisingly details to them. And again, my point is that for a lot of people, it's like if this is the fourth mechanic you're learning, if you haven't played either of these games, you are now learning about the fourth, kind of eighth mechanic during this parlay. And you know the term lifesteal. You know what I mean? It's just one less little thing. So I think that's valuable. But again, it does slightly, it's not always how lifesteal works. I don't know. On to a similar situation. First strike versus quick attack. This is my job. Deals damage before its blocker when attacking. First strike works on defense as well, but that's been less common in more recent Magic design. Yeah, so first strike and quick attack. The idea is that when they, I don't know what you mean by it's been less common in more recent matches. First strike still works on defense. I hope they didn't change that. That would be confusing. But that's been less common in more recent Magic design. Blocking? First strike on defensive creatures? Anyway, yeah, it applies to defending in Magic. I don't know if it does in Legends of Runeterra. Okay, so quick attack. If we imagined it didn't work on defense. Okay, what I like about First Strike is that it's very literal, and this is a thing where it feels like you can be literal. You're imagining the creatures go wham and hit each other, and your creature like hits first, and so the other one dies. In Magic, normally, creatures do their damage to each other simultaneously, and so you hit first. If you kill your attacker, they don't get to hit you back before dying. And so it strikes first. First strike. Nice. And of course, this will double up with the next keyword we're going to talk about. I like First Strike, and I can see Quick Attack working like if it was only on the offense. You know, Quick Attack is sort of like, okay, well, if it worked on defense, that would be kind of weird. That people get hung up on this kind of stuff. I don't, but people do. But I don't know. I think First Strike is interesting because, again, it has the flexibility of not implying attack, and first. I really like first. It's not that it's fast, it's that it's what you need to know is that it's first, not like it is fast. Like, what do you mean? I would say learning this game. But first strike is like, okay, it attacks first, it strikes first, it does what it says it does. So I like that one. It's funny because compared to the examples we had before, flying, reach, trample, first strike is a very martial description, a little unusual for Magic, although First Strike is often the signature keyword of White, which has a lot of civilization, soldiers, the idea of an army is very White. And so these trained combatants, training is pretty White as a card design philosophy. White mana is often summoning trained or militant creatures, you know, soldiers or even beasts that are trained in combat, and so they can strike first. And that, I think, fits pretty well. Like, that feels martial, but that just happens to work that way for Magic. Again, Quick Attack, maybe I'm also thinking Pokemon a little bit too much, but I feel like it doesn't particularly imply any, like, a lot from a lore perspective. First Strike feels a little martial. I think being lore neutral is nice, but I think that first is better than quick in this case. So I'm going to say this one is mostly a wash, but Quick Attack, I guess it's a win if it doesn't work on defense. That's nice. That's a little peculiar, so it's nice that the name has attack in it if it's not going to work on defense. That's cute. I don't know. Moving on to an even more what's happening to me topic, Double Strike versus Double Attack. I wonder what it does. Now, unfortunately, this one is, at least in Magic, a little more confusing than it at first seems. Double Strike. So you do damage twice, right? Well, but you specifically do first strike damage and then just also do normal combat damage. There's a first strike damage step, and then if you have double strike, you also do damage if your opponent survives and would then hit you back, then you do damage during that damage step too. If you hit an opponent directly, you do damage during the first strike damage step, and then you do it again during the normal damage step. You do hit twice, but you also have first strike, and only half of the damage happens during first strike. Again, maybe it's straightforward if you just think it's first strike, and then when the enemy gets to attack, you just get to attack simultaneously as well. And I like that double strike, like first strike, double strike. And you can see that Legends of Runeterra did the same thing. Quick attack, double attack. Okay. But it doesn't necessarily roll in the idea that, like, this is also first strike. Or I guess to me, the strength of first strike as a keyword helps double strike kind of sink in. This is one where I personally feel like the fantasy is quite key. You see first strike on swordsmen, fencers, lancer type characters, and then when double strike is shown on cards, like Magic the Gathering cards that have that type of martial character on them, I think a lot of people just naturally, intuitively understand, oh, they have like super first strike, basically. They do double damage, that's intuitive. And then like, look, they have a fencing rapier, just like 90% of the creatures with first strike or whatever. And so they also get first strike, you know. That might not be immediately intuitive to a lot of people, but if you then told them that was the rule, I think a lot of people would go, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense, visual sense in some way. This is why I don't like quick attack, double attack. It's lore neutral, but this is a place where I feel like it helps smooth over like a kind of obvious but kind of weird quirk in the rules for Magic, that the keywords have that kind of lore distinction. First strike, it feels like you did a tactic and then you've got more tactics, and so double strike. A double strike is also frequently on beasts that are depicted to be really ferocious. And I think that works too. You imagine they would attack fast, but then quick attack sounds kind of good. It's a little bit of a toss-up. And again, I'm biased because I'm used to the Magic ones, but I can see how both of these work. I just wanted to make the point that the martial association from First Strike works well here, I think, and would help reinforce it, since First Strike is a pretty common keyword, and then if you see Double Strike on like a trained fighter, it kind of feels like, oh, okay, they also get to First Strike. Cool. So, neat. And then we have two more. These are keywords that Magic the Gathering doesn't have keyworded, but they're concepts that are in the game. I'm going to talk about just the first one, and then I have a few other examples I want to cover before we go. So this one is Daunt, quote unquote, versus Fearsome. This means you can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Magic the Gathering doesn't technically have this keyworded, but it seems this is a Wizard of the Coast internal nickname for that mechanic. Yep. I had heard this before. Daunt, as they call it internally. The idea is that you can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. You scare smaller creatures, kind of. In Magic, I think this is often replaced with Menace, which is a keyword that says you can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures, not by creatures with power 2 or less, but by 2 or more creatures. Menace, the creature is scary, and so creatures won't block it unless they block together, unless they have a buddy. And this is similar to the outcome of Daunt. It can't be blocked by small creatures, but bigger creatures, aren't afraid of it or whatever, so they'll stand up to it. But we'll talk about Daunt for now. So Fearsome is the Legends of Runeterra name. Pretty good. You get the idea that small creatures would be scared of it. Again, there is a little bit of like a restriction where you have to imagine that the small creatures would always be afraid, and some types of small creatures have the trope, like goblins, that they're fodder creatures, and it's like, well, would they be afraid? Sometimes, but a lot of the time the lore with creatures like goblins is they're very YOLO. They'll go right in there no matter what. So, not perfect, but overall, I think Fearsome is pretty good. Daunt is fun, but it's kind of awkward in this form, isn't it? Daunting, okay, but to daunt, you can say that. I was daunted, I guess, but Fearsome is pretty clean. That's nice. I think Menace is a great keyword, personally. It's not the same thing, but that related one. So, Fearsome, good. I also think that this is a nice one because it kind of does the opposite of the problem I had with Sharp Sight, where it's like, well, a lot of creatures that might have this keyword have eyes. Why can't you just depict them as being sharp-sighted? Okay, but Fear is a really easy to pick up, but also really open-ended concept. I feel like it's really, really easy to depict creatures as being all kinds of things, as being scary. You can do it with something as simple as the lighting in the piece of art for the card. So it's a very advantageous type of keyword to have. Menace in Magic, again, it's not the exact same thing, but that's as close as we've got, is, in my opinion, usually really easily, really well depicted. It's not hard to just like add that to stuff. And again, it's a little subjective, so you can see, yeah, now that you say Menace, it is kind of scary. That creature is scary. It reminds me a little bit of Death Touch, a mechanic in Magic that says that the creature can kill anything it fights, any creature it fights, by doing any amount of damage to it. So if a 1/1 has Death Touch and it damages any creature, the creature it damages dies. 1 damage is enough to kill any creature it damages. It's got Death Touch. Like a snake. They're snakes, usually. A 1/1 with Death Touch, a snake, a poisonous snake. If a creature has Death Touch and it's not immediately clear, like, what is poison, what is Death Touchy about it, what is poisonous about it, you can look at the creature and go, Yeah, but I could see that creature having poisonous venom. You see what I mean? And I think that Menace and Fearsome do the same thing. If you put this keyword on a card, they kind of reverse lore the mechanic into making a little bit of sense. And that was my point before. These are abstract but familiar concepts, and so it's really easy to kind of understand why a creature would be like that and just intuitively go, oh yeah, small creatures won't be willing to block this guy. Fine. That's okay. I'm scared of it too, you might think. Or this creature has death touch. I don't immediately see why it would be poisonous, but I don't know. It looks like a weird, scary, shadow beast or something from the marshes. Sure, it's poisonous, whatever. And indeed, a lot of creatures with menace have death touch as a part of their balancing. They can only be double blocked. That's what menace is in Magic. And they immediately kill their attacker if they do any damage. So they usually trade very well if they attack, and they have to be at least double blocked, and then they can assign 1 damage to each of their attackers and kill them both. Pretty good. Another trick they often do is make those creatures have only 1 power, so they do need to be double blocked, but you only get to kill 1 of the blockers, guaranteed, to make it a little less powerful. Cool. So yeah, fearsome, great. And these fear-based mechanics, also a shout out for Death Touch, I guess, I really like. I think that's an interesting one. I will talk about Brash, actually, since you included it and it's kind of similar. It says it can't be blocked by creatures with toughness 2 or less. This is a confusing one. So fearsome in Legends of Runeterra is can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. This is the same thing, but it checks toughness. Now, vampbug leaves a note that in Legends of Runeterra, creatures don't heal their damage taken by default at end of turn, so this is good evasion. The idea is that if a creature is damaged, it might then become unable to block creatures with Brash, because I guess they're confident, and so they don't mind brawling through damaged opponents or weaker opponents. But they're not really confident. Brash as the keyword for that. Yeah, I'm not totally sold on that one, but it's one where you can imagine, again, this is an open-ended concept to some extent. Anything depicted as kind of aggressive, you feel like you can sort of justify, like, oh, it'll go in to attack people willingly, and then creatures that aren't very hardy won't be willing to stand against it. I guess. Personally, I think it's a little ugly that both these mechanics exist, but I understand that not having permanent damage, or having more permanent damage in Legends of Runeterra, makes this significantly different in context. When a creature is fearsome, creatures can't block it based on an intrinsic quality. How much power do they have, period. You might modify their power, sure, but how much power do they have? Whereas if a creature is brash, there might be creatures that can currently block it, but if you damage them a little bit, they will no longer be able to block it permanently, unless they get healed if you do a little damage to them. So I'm not saying there's no distinction, but you can see when it gets down to this kind of thing, I don't know. Personally, I get into why is fearsome the one that checks power and brash the one that checks toughness? And brash, that's like, again, another abstract concept, but not something I think people are as comfortable with as fear. So, and it's not as abstract. Like, I have difficulty thinking of a lot of types of beings as brash. But again, I'd clocked this idea earlier in Legends of Runeterra's wording that elusive, sharp-sight, these are terms that sound like they're used to describe mostly humanoids, and so maybe brash is actually surprisingly open-ended. But fearsome kind of sounds more beast. I don't know. And it's subjective. Again, for any of these, you might go, Sandy, you're crazy. Fearsome doesn't sound like beasts. Fearsome is a term only for swashbuckling sailors. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't know. I just personally, I don't think it's as decisive a term, but I don't think that's a huge deal there. Brash, I think of as being more associated with humanoids. Don't get me wrong, I'm the first person who will identify a griffin as a brash attacker or something like that. Of course, I understand that. Just to say, if we have to look at what the differences are, and you accept my thesis from the beginning of the parlay, that these terms have subtle, but in aggregate actually pretty impactful effects on how people interpret your game design, these little differences are all there is. They're what there is as a difference. So I'm not saying it's a huge difference, but that's the difference that's there. That's all I have to say. I want to add a little bit of my own example because I think that the takeaway from this parlay that interests me is applying this information. Overall, I think that both are pretty good. I really like the magic ones. I actually thought better of them than I thought I would. When I read this parlay the first time, I thought magic was going to get kind of But I think part of the reason I was pretty high on the magic ones is you picked a lot of magic's best keywords, in my opinion. Besides menace, I feel like flying, reach, and trample are really good, like very, very strong to the point that I would just use those if I was making a game. I would try pretty hard, at least, to just use those. A lot of games try to kind of redo them, and legally, I don't know to what extent this is required. But I guess where I'm going with this is that in a lot of games I've played, the verbiage is not as like unarguably competent, I guess. There are more obvious problems in a lot of games I've played than there are in these two card games, as far as I can tell anyway. And I want to briefly give you an example of one of those places and what I did about it, applying this logic. So let's use what we've learned, and you can decide if you want to do this too. It's something that vampbug, I know you're interested in as well. Tabletop role-playing games. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there are a couple of classes that have names that I think are bad. They're bad, and you should change them, and your game will be immediately significantly better if you just call that class something else. In a way that I think people would initially say that's silly and pedantic, but if I explain it, I wonder if you'll change your mind. The biggest offender, in my opinion, is the cleric. Cleric sounds like a healer to a lot of people, and people have played role-playing games where there are healer classes. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is not designed for you to have dedicated healers. The game's math and mechanics are not built in a way where that is normally like even a sustainable thing to do, let alone an effective or required thing to do. There's plenty of healing, don't get me wrong. You can play a kind of burst heal build, and it can be really fun to do, but those are pretty specialized things, and even the cleric subclasses that are focused on more healing magic also have substantial offensive magic that they would want to be using a lot of the time, let's put it that way. But because it's called a cleric, a lot of people get in this mindset where, like, because the game calls it a cleric, they feel like that means you're supposed to heal if you use it. Again, we're back to the beginning of the parlay where that's not, I mean, what do you mean supposed to? Like, what do the mechanics do? If the game gives you a healing ability and then gives you an offensive ability and they do about the same damage, but the class is called cleric, does that mean magically you're supposed to do the heal ability and then somehow through some mystical process, you being supposed to heal makes the heal ability objectively stronger? No, of course it doesn't. The heal ability is just as effective as it was before. If you're supposed to use the healing ability, the game designers just don't know what they're doing because it's still mathematically better to use the offensive ability, all things being equal anyway, in this contrived example. And I think that's true in 5th edition. Again, whether you agree with that or not, cleric, I hope you'll agree, does bias people in practice. Just look at Baldur's Gate 3 statistics to think that you're like meant to heal bot. Now, again, a lot of players are making a very simple mistake here. They just don't notice that if they were attacking, it would be just as effective or more effective. And so blame them. A lot of people say the gaming community at large tends to kind of simplify this discussion and say, well, but that's players just being stupid. And it's like, okay, but the act of game design is to manipulate that thing about players. And let me put it another way. If you call your cleric class acolyte instead, I mean, does anything like break? Does anything go wrong? And so, yes, you might not agree that players should be mistaking cleric for a healer. They should just think for themselves a little bit. But like, if you change it to something that doesn't make them mistake it for a healer and doesn't make them mistake it for something else, some people might think acolyte is too evil or culty, change it to whatever you want. priest, I still feel like Healy. That actually feels a little more Healy to me. But how it will feel to everyone is different, of course. I'm just saying if you got a name that didn't give anybody any associations, we would agree that can only be better, right? We might disagree about how much better it is. You think it's not a very big problem and I do, or whatever. But there's no question it's only advantageous as long as we can avoid another association, right? We just disagree about how advantageous it is. But it's a word that you can just change. And so surely if there's an advantage, I mean, that's just free real estate, right? My other pet example is Ranger. Ranger, really? Okay, so let's see some of the features of the Ranger class. You seem to have written a bunch of melee attacks into this class that's really good if you use melee weapons. You seem to have made a class called Ranger that is an excellent hit and run duelist with melee weapons. Why? Why would you do that? I don't do that. Hunter is right there. I mean, but then are they hunting? There's a subclass, there's a ranger subclass called Hunter. But I mean, you could just change the name of that. And it's also terrible, so you could just buff that class too. And there you go. So I think this is a surprisingly big deal. Again, it's not so much that it's the end of the world. People can just learn that cleric doesn't necessarily mean you need to heal or whatever. And you could take other routes to this. You could leave cleric named cleric, but like remove healing spells or something. Take some out or make people get them later or whatever. But why? It's nice to have them as a utility in the game, and you could do something much easier, change the name of the cleric class to get the same effect, if not better, to some extent. It lets players have an open-ended idea of what is their acolyte like. You know, you might feel too much like a warlock, but you get this feeling like you're praying to a god, and what are the boons that god provides? It could be any number of things. And that adds to a lot of the flavor of the cleric. It feels like, what kind of boon does this devotee of some elder deity bestow upon their followers? Acolyte, to me, does that pretty well. If it doesn't for you, that's okay, but I hope it explains my point. I think that cleric and priest, to a lesser extent, are somewhat objectively causing a problem, and you can solve that problem with insert name here that you agree with for that argument. Same thing with ranger, a little more directly. Fighter as well. I don't love a lot of the alternatives for fighter. It's fine. I think the thing about fighter is it's just too open-ended. Warrior, though, warrior sounds a little melee. And again, like rangers not necessarily being ranged, fighters, warriors, aren't necessarily melee combatants. In fact, there's several fighter subclasses that are specifically designed around ranged combat. So not only are they just subjectively, obviously you just can use a bow as a fighter, objectively, you must use ranged weapons as some fighter subclasses. So somewhat objectively, the idea that it's a melee sounding name is kind of wrong, but just what name will sound what you're looking for obviously is a little bit more difficult. Again, while I like to highlight that these things are still going to be subjective to each person, they're not completely subjective either. There is existing somewhere in the ether of human understanding, maybe hard for us to access, but somewhere you could acquire the statistics and, sample size needed to basically determine, do people think acolyte is neutral enough? There is a overall yes or overall no answer. That is a possible answer you could get. I'm just not going to claim to know it. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, but you'd want to check. If you're designing a game, I would try to gather data somehow, or at least test it with like a lot of people or something. So what specific term? I don't know or care, honestly, but I like acolyte for cleric, and I think for ranger, hunter is easy enough. That's fine. And you could just rename the hunter subclass pretty easily. There might be an acolyte. Acolyte's probably a background in 5th edition, isn't it? But anyway, again, it really doesn't matter. Like, that stuff is easy. So, I don't know. I mean, it's funny. This Parley, if you can't tell, is really in my wheelhouse. I like this type of subject. I think it's interesting. It gets into the psychological type of game design that I think people really, really underdo. Like, there's not enough of that done for the, frankly, tremendous benefits that it can provide for very, very little, almost no work sometimes. If you just think about how a word you're using might make some players feel. but it's surprisingly difficult for a lot of developers in practice. And the main reason, in my opinion, is that they tend to get hung up on feeling like they have the correct definition for a word, the single correct definition for a word. I will not, any more than I already have during this parlay, bemoan the point that that just like kind of doesn't exist, or like who cares, even if you think you have that. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that actually makes your players have more fun, you know, with your game design that you're doing for a living so people will have fun, and there's not really other good reason to do that. The only thing that actually does something in the real world is to accept that people have these associations and that words are a democracy. But you don't have to agree with that. You just have to get no effects out of your game design unless you agree with that. Was that enough of a... I thought this was an awesome parlay, vampbug. I'm interested where this one came from. This is a really interesting like type of parlay topic. I would love to see more like this. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, you can check that out using a link in the description. Vampbug, thank you very much for this one. I had a really good time. Looking forward to the next one.